So what are you seeing tonight?
Yes, we'll know.
We'll know after we go. Oh, we were both found out at the last time we did. But then you came to Leo and people go see people over and go. On my side.
Is that a good recipe?
It's always good, right?
All right.
Yeah. She's really having trouble for the 18.
Good morning, Jerry.
Yeah.
Are we all packed?
Yeah.
No,
No.
Yeah. Well, I'm
Not
meeting-
Packed the night before. What time's your flight?
I go, that's important.
7:30.
Where you going?
Tuesday, right?
Tuesday.
Ah,
For a week? 2 weeks?
One.
1 week, 1
I
Sunday.
need. Like I said, that's one part of the country I have not explored, like the Northeast. I told my mom I wanted to go to Maine to see a lighthouse. She was like, "What?"
I can go to Washington.
That's
see a
everybody.
lighthouse.
So look, everybody keeps saying the same thing. Because I was in Texas when I said this. Like, there's lighthouses in Texas.
Just go down in the morning and look out and see where.
If you love the beaches, I would suggest Cape Cod. They have lovely lighthouses, but they don't have nice beaches.
And then I was talking to one of my former members. He was like, "You need to come down to Sarasota." I was like, "Maybe I shouldn't." He's like, he's loving it down there. So we'll get there.
But Cape Cod is pretty ugly in the winter time.
Oh, boy.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
What about in the summer?
Oh, I love it.
wonderful, marvelous. It can get pretty hot, but you know, you got the ocean. The thing is with the East Coast is the water, the wind is offshore.
Mm.
So it doesn't, you don't get the cooling air from the, you know, always blows.
Right.
We're here, it's always onshore.
Right. Whereas like so where I'm from in South Carolina, we're like 50 miles from Myrtle Beach.
And I still.
And so like you said, when you go to Myrtle Beach, it's blazing hot.
It's really hot.
It's cool when you get to the water, you know what I'm saying? But actually on the beach.
You don't get an onshore breeze all that often.
Right.
I mean, the predominant wind is offshore. So it's taking the heat from the land and going into the water. I like it.
It's pretty.
Tell the neighbor.
Yes, tell Bruce. It's so Myrtle Beach is nice, but you know when you live close to stuff, you're kind of like everyone's like, oh, you live that close to Myrtle Beach, you'll go. I'm like, you know, you get a little jaded by it, you know, you maybe take it for granted a little bit.
Myrtle Beach, hurricane.
Hey,
Why Myrtle Beach?
well, that's only in hurricane season. South Carolina generally doesn't get a ton of hurricanes. We get some, but we generally don't get. And where I lived at, we're like an hour, like 60 miles inland. So by the time it hit us, it's mostly a lot of rain and wind and stuff like that. Now, I mean, some damage can be done. I mean, there was this huge tree in my grandma's yard. I mean, like it was like he had been there for a while. It just knocked it over. It was crazy.
Oh, yeah, my brother, predatory condo that he. On Myrtle Beach.
I don't think Liv says I don't think you can afford enough insurance to get something. I keep telling my wife I wanted some vacation property in Myrtle Beach. She's like, the insurance is gonna cost more than the condo.
You can't afford the insurance.
I mean, every place has something, right? You can't escape it. Every place has something, right? Myrtle Beach is beautiful, but you gotta worry about hurricanes. When I was in Tennessee, we used to be not too far from Pigeon Forge.
I don't.
That's pretty.
What is Ford?
Pigeon Forge. That's where it's like up in the mountains. That's where Dollywood is. So I tell people if you like Myrtle Beach, you'll like Pigeon Forge, because Pigeon Forge seems like to me all the stuff you get in Myrtle Beach, just up in the mountains.
It's cool. There's no beach.
No beach. You get mountain, you have some pretty mountain views. Yeah, you get some pretty views and stuff. It's a pretty part of the country. Because I remember the first time I drove to Nashville, I had to drive through like the Smoky Mountains. I was like, oh, this is pretty. But it's also scary. Because you're on this little 2-lane road. Because my friend told me, he said, hey, when you start going into those mountains, make sure you get gas because there is no, no place to stop. I was driving this huge Penske truck. I'm like,
This could be,
all right.
Oh, I love it.
Let us get started. How's everybody doing this morning?
How are you doing?
I am yeah, yeah, I am tired. I'm tired both physically and mentally.
Things on your plate.
Right. So we're okay.
So did it rain on your trip back from Texas?
No, it was fairly clear. And I was telling Ruth earlier, the only spot I had any trouble was I stopped in Boise for the night. And when I leave in Boise, going in like to Oregon, it was snowing and sleeting a little bit there.
Blue Mountains.
And then it kind of cleared up. And then once it got past that, it was pretty much like it was like all snowy and stuff. And then you could see like once I got close to Washington, it looked all brown. I was like, oh, okay. So it pretty much was rest of the trip from that point on was pretty much good.
So you decided not to come up the freeway from LA?
Well, what ended up happening is I had spent the night in Albuquerque, which is my usual stopping spot, and then I was headed towards California, and I put it in my GPS. It said winter weather warning.
Oh,
Like,
yeah.
Yeah.
I was like, maybe. So then I looked. That's because my plan was, but then I was like, okay, it's clear going up to Rivers to what is it, Redding? Because that's what I was planning on stopping, try to stop for the night, right? But then north of Redding, you know, when you get to those mountains, get ready to go into Oregon, it said winter weather warning. I was like, maybe I should avoid this. So I went the way I've gone the last 2 times, and like I said, outside of Boise, there was no real weather.
Yeah, it's always, that's always.
It wasn't even bad. It wasn't like it was sticking. It was like once it hit your car, it turned into rain for the most part. So it was good. Well, we made it safely. Praise Jesus.
Kind of a low pass. It's surprising how bad the weather gets because it's inland.
Yeah. So it was. I was worried about taking the pass. I thought the pass was gonna be horrible, but I drove through it no problem. It was like because I was in these horror stores, so everybody living right here. You want to go through the pass in the spring or the winter? It's like horrible. And so I was driving right. I was like, oh, this is fine. By the time I noticed it, I was like by the time I noticed, I was like, oh, this is like I'm in Issaquah. Like I'm almost home
Oh,
now.
you're talking about some falling.
Yes, no problem.
Oh, yeah, but people in the Northwest panic if there's an inch of snow. So,
That's because so many hills around here, so it makes sense. Like where I live in Seattle, like you can slide real easy down some stuff. So I get it. All right. On Sunday, we talked about getting outside of our comfort zone. So today we're going to be talking about taking risk. Why do we do that? Why do we take risk? Risk.
but you have to, you can't live without a risk.
Thank you. Right. Risks are a part of life. There you go. Risks are a part of life, right?
Like
Getting married is a risk, right?
Thinking of my book.
Sure. Clean it up, right? But things are, it's risk, right? Deciding if I'm going to go to college to join the workforce. There's risk in both, right? Get yourself in a bunch of debt, go to college, right? It's a risk of that. The risk of going into the workforce and you're being stuck in something. You know what I'm saying? It's risk in everything. But what we have to learn, what we have to understand is in life, when you play it too safe, you oftentimes miss out because as we're going to talk about, risk in many ways equates to faith. When it comes to faith, you have to be willing to take some level of risk. Okay, that's what we're going to talk about today. All right, let's look at the definition for the word risk. This is probably just from like Wikipedia, not Wikipedia, but risk: hazard, peril, danger, peril, exposure to loss, injury, or destruction. This is why we try to avoid risk because of that first definition, right? We don't want to experience that hazard of loss, liability, or loss of property, to expose to risk, hazard, or peril, to venture as to risk goods on board a ship, risk one's person in battle, to risk one's fame by publication, to incur risk or danger as to risk a battle. All right. So we're looking at these words risk, and it seems there's some level of danger involved, right? Whether it's property, whether it's financial, whether it's even your own character. There's some risk being taken. Okay. Faith versus risk. Faith requires us to take risks. Let's give an example. Let's look at 2 Chronicles 20. 2 Chronicles 20. Second Chronicles 20 through 26. Who has that one for us?
I have it here.
All right.
Second Chronicles 20, 20
Hmm?
to 26.
Yeah, I ain't seen that.
Early in the morning,
Okay.
they left the desert of Tekoa. As they set out, Jehoshaphat stood and said, "Listen to me, Judah, and people of Jerusalem. Have faith in the Lord your God, and you will be upheld. Have faith in his prophets, and you will be successful." After consulting the people, Jehoshaphat appointed men to sing to the Lord and to praise him for the splendor of his holiness. As they went out at the head of the army, saying, "Give thanks to the Lord, for his love endures forever." As they began to sing praise, the Lord set ambushes against the men of Ammon and Moab and Mount Seir, who were invading Judah, and they were defeated. The men of Ammon and Moab rose up against the men of Mount Seir to destroy and annihilate them. After they finished slaughtering the men from Seir, they helped to destroy one another. When the men of Judah came to the place that overlooks the desert and looked toward the vast army, they saw only dead bodies lying on the ground. No one had escaped. So Jehoshaphat and his men went to carry off their plunder, and they found among them great amount of equipment and clothing, and also articles of value, more than they could take away. There was so much plunder that it took 3 days to collect it. On the fourth day, they assembled in the valley of the Baraka,
Mhm.
and they praised the Lord. This is why it is called the Valley of Baraka to this day.
All right. So, did anybody remember what's going on with Jehoshaphat? Jehoshaphat is facing trouble. 3 kingdoms are coming against Judah, right? So he turns to the prophet, and the prophet tells Jehoshaphat, "Don't worry about it. God's going to fight this battle for you. You're not even going to have to lift up your sword." So he tells them to go to this spot in the desert, and he said, "Send in the praisers and begin to praise God." That's a level of faith, right? Because Jehoshaphat had to trust that what he got from the prophet was from God, right? And listen what God's telling him to do. Don't even go to fight. Go prepared to fight, but you're not even going to have to fight. I'm going to take this over. You're thinking to yourself, like, that doesn't even add up, right? Like, that doesn't even make sense, really. A lot of times when you're doing stuff out of faith, it doesn't make man sense. It makes God sense, right? What sense does it make to go and send out? Look, he said he had warriors there, but who did he send in first? The praise team, basically. Don't go fight this battle. We're going to send the praise team in first. Let them do their thing. And then God says that's going to be all we need. That takes faith. There you go. So imagine getting up that morning to walk out to the spot in the desert just to hear Jehoshaphat say, "Oh, we're going to send in the praise team." What? I think Jehoshaphat's going crazy. Right? You know, they were murmuring. Yeah, right. They think he's going Looney Tunes. Faith sometimes makes you look loony. Because that was some crazy stuff to do. If you look at it just from a surface level, right? That makes no sense. All right, let's look at risk. Risk requires us stepping out of our faith for God. Let's turn to 2 Kings chapter number 7.
Now there were 4 men with leprosy at the entrance of the city gate. They said to each other, "Why stay here until we die? If we say we'll go into the city, the famine is there and we will die. And if we stay here, we will die. So let's go over to the camp of the Armenians and surrender. If they spare us, we live. If they kill us, we die." A lot of dying going on. At dusk, they got up and went to the camp of the Armenians. And when they reached the edge of the camp, no one was there. For the Lord had caused the Armenians to hear the sound of chariots and horses and a great army. So that they said to one another, "Look, the king of Israel has hired the Hittite and Egyptian kings to attack us." So they got up and fled in the dusk, and abandoned their tents, their horses, their donkeys, and they left the camp as if was and ran for their lives. The men who had leprosy reached the edge of the camp, entered one of the tents and ate and drank. Then they took silver, gold, clothes and went off and hid them. They returned and entered another tent, took some things from it and hid them also. Then they said to each other, what are we gonna do? What we're doing is not right. This is a day of good news and we are keeping it to ourselves. If we wait until daylight, punishment will overtake us. So let's go at once and report this to the royal palace. So they went, called out to the city gatekeepers and told them, we went into the Armenian camp, and no one was there, not a sound or anyone, only tethered horses, donkeys, and just as they were.
All right. So notice this particular these gentlemen are lepers, right? And because they have leprosy, remember, so let me say this. Leprosy is not what we call modern day leprosy is, I think it's called like Hansen disease or whatever. This is when they have these uncontrollable swelling and things like that. In the Bible, any kind of skin condition generally was considered leprosy, right? Eczema could be considered leprosy. Any kind of skin condition. You got to remember this, they lived in an arid environment. They lived in close quarters. So any kind of skin disease would be quickly passed on. So
pimples, the pork.
I don't know if it was that bad, but but I get what you're saying. Could be if you had a bad bump and it turned a certain color or something like that, then you had to get inspected by the priest. You are correct. There's something in there. If it was a certain color of the hair, if the hair was a certain color, then it was safe. If it wasn't, then you had leprosy. The hair turned white. That's what it was. Yeah, the hair turned white in the pimple. They thought you had leprosy, and then you had to be outside the camp.
Not for that white hair.
So leprosy. So that was considered leprosy. So these guys were outcasts basically because you couldn't come back into the city. You couldn't participate in anything if you had leprosy. That's why leprosy was such a big deal, right? Because you lived on the outside of the camp. So listen, they were on the outside of the camp, and the city was being so. Modern war technique, the technique that most people did war in back in those days was this. Most cities had walls, right? Most cities had walls. All your land and stuff was outside the walls, like all your grain and stuff like that. So what people would do, how do I take over the city without having a bunch of casualties? We would go surround the city, eat all your grain that's out there that you can't tend to, and just let you starve to death. We just wait. You're either gonna die of starvation, you're gonna die of thirst. And then listen, once you're weakened by hunger and thirst, we just basically walk in, slaughter the rest of you if you want to. So it's you gotta understand, the goal in war is to commit the most casualties without receiving, but minimizing the casualties you receive. So sieges were a pretty popular form of war because it minimized your casualties and inflicted a bunch of casualties on the people. And really all you had to do was just wait. They couldn't go out and farm. So they usually had food in the storage. But once they ate up all that food in storage, then what? So you just wait them out. They sit out there in the field eating their grain, looking at them, waiting them out. So the siege is going on. The people are getting hungry, right? The food's drying up. And these lepers are basically having a conversation with themselves saying, what's the point in us sitting here? Like Brad said, we sit here, we die. We go to the city, we die. If we go to the camp and they capture us and kill us, we die. But there is a chance they're taking a risk because there's a slight chance they could go to the Armenian camp and Armenians would let them come into their camp. So the way they thought about it was, we're going to risk it because there's a small chance that we might be saved. And so when they get there, they see that the Armenians had fled. And their first thought is, oh, we about to go eat. So they're just eating, drinking, having themselves a merry old time. They're finding clothes and stuff, and they're burying it because gold and silver. Because I don't know why they was taking all that gold. They couldn't use it unless they could go back into the city. So maybe they were burying it just in case they could get back in the city. I was like, oh, I got all this gold. Now I'm gonna come back rich. But then they came to their senses and says, you know what? This isn't right. So they go report it to Judah. The reason why I'm bringing that up is if you notice, there's a lot of similarities between having faith, which Jehoshaphat did, going out there, trusting God that he was going to take care of these armies, and these lepers using a level of risk. Do you see the similarities? You see how there's a correlation between the two? Like what the lepers did wasn't, when you wouldn't necessarily call it faith, because they weren't doing it because they thought God had told them to go do it, or they thought, but it was a gamble. They took a gamble. They said, hey, there's a chance we can survive. Let's just try it. If not, we're gonna die anyway, so we're just speeding up the inevitable. But then you look at Jehoshaphat, it was a risk of him going out there and God not doing what he said he was gonna do, right? It took faith for Jehoshaphat to walk out there. And so, but it also took faith for them to take the word back to Judah, because they could have not listened. They could have killed them for coming close to the gate with their leprosy. So faith and risk are something that's required throughout our walk with God. All right. Now, we're moving into one of my absolute favorite books of the Bible, the book of Esther. It's one of my absolute favorite books of the Bible. It's one of my favorite, I think partly because there's not a ton of female-led stories in the Bible. There's some, but this and Ruth is probably the only two that are specifically focusing on women, right? And so we're going to jump to Esther 4, but I want to give some backstory as to what's going on in the book of Esther, okay? So, Esther, it's in the Old Testament. So Esther was likely her this is during the time of exile, when she was in Babylon. So Esther was probably her Babylonian name. Her Jewish name was Hadassah. Her cousin was named Mordecai. So we're assuming her parents had passed on, and her cousin Mordecai was looking after her, right? So that means she likely was an orphan. Her parents could have died in the exile. They could have died coming over to Babylon, whatever. And so if you remember why the exile happens, Judah and Israel are their own kingdoms, but they continually kept worshiping foreign gods. And so God got tired of it and basically said, I'm going to have the end of this, and use the Babylonians and then the Assyrians to go and and so what they would do is, what the Babylonians would do is, when they came to an area, right? So let's say they came to Seattle. Let's say they owned the entire West Coast. They would come to Seattle. They would take over the people there. Then they would ship them down to, say, Oregon or down to California, because it's hard for you to rebel when you're not in your homeland. Does that make any sense? And then the best and the brightest, they would say, hey, you seem smart. We're going to take you to Babylon and come work for us. Why not? Why not employ the smart people to help keep your kingdom going? So that's kind of what they did. Because if you notice in the text, you hear about the Jewish people, the Israelites fighting the Philistines, like constantly, right? Once the exile happens, you don't hear anything else about the Philistines, because the Babylonians was like the ancient version of an atomic bomb. When they hit, usually nothing came back. So the fact that Israel still existed, it came back into existence and all the other stuff, is a big deal, because most other cultures, once the Babylonians came through, that was it. They took you all the way out. So, so Esther was a Jewish young lady. She was living with her cousin in Babylon, in Susa, I think it's the capital. The title is capital city. Okay. So before we get to Esther 4, here's what's going on. Esther 1 opens up with the king of Babylon having this huge party, right? He has this huge party. And kings would do that sometimes. They would have these parties that lasted like a month. I don't know how long y'all ever partied in your life, but I don't know if you ever partied for a month straight. All right, don't say anything, Neil.
Sleeping a lot.
No, they would party literally, like drinking, revelry for a month straight. The reason why the kings would do this, they wanted to show their opulence. They wanted to show how much money, and look, I got so much money, I could fund a 30-day party and it does nothing to my royal reserves, right? So they're having this party. The king's got a little bit of wine in him. He's feeling good. He's getting loose, right? And so what would happen is the king and his noblemen would party on one spot, and their wives would party to another spot, right? Just kind of where it went, because usually the men got into some stuff they didn't want their wives to see, right? So the king calls his wife, Vashti, to come before him, right? Some people say Vashti. Just pretend how you want to pronounce it. And she refuses. She says, I'm not. No. Part of it was the only people who came into the king's presence during that time was his side pieces, was his other women. And so she was the queen. You're not gonna disrespect me. There's other scholars who believe he wanted her to come and stand before, because he wanted to show off her beauty. Some people say he wanted her to come stand before his friends butt naked. That's a whole other story. Kings are weird like that. Anyways, she refuses. She refuses, right? And the king's drunk, so he gets mad. And so all of his noblemen are like, hey man, you're gonna have to do something about this. You can't have your wife disrespecting you and you the king. What are our wives gonna do for us? And he said, yeah, you're right, I gotta do something. So they said, here's what you do. You write a royal edict that Queen Vashti could never come in your presence again. And he's like, you know what, you're right. So he writes the edict, and essentially he's divorcing her. Because the way the Babylonian kings work is whatever you put out as your royal edict, you couldn't repeal it. Right? So if you said she can't come in your presence again, that's it. And so he does that. After he does that, he kind of starts having some regret, you know what I'm saying? And so he's all like, man, that probably wasn't the smartest move. I was drunk. Maybe shouldn't have told my old lady to leave me alone. I'm over here lonely now. I kind of regret this. And so his, the noblemen come again like, king, man, we see you all depressed because you lost your old lady. Look, but you're the king though. Here's what you can do. We're going to find all the prettiest women in the land, right? All the prettiest women in your kingdom. This is horrible, but this is what happened. You sleep with them. Whichever one you like become the next queen. And he was like, I like that idea. I wonder why, right? So he's all aboard on this idea, right? So they go through and they snatch up all these women. Esther is one of the ones who gets snatched up. Mordecai was one of the king's, he worked for the king. So he kind of told us that, hey, you don't tell him about your heritage. Don't tell him I'm your cousin. You know what I'm saying? Keep that to yourself. So the king is out here. So they had to go through all these beauty treatments, but Esther found favor with some of the eunuchs. And so they gave her double the beauty treatments they gave the other ladies, right? I don't know what they made them do. Who knows? And so after all this happened, she gets her time with the king. The king is pleased with her. Use your imagination. And then she becomes queen. She becomes queen. Around this time, Mordecai uncovers a plot of these guys trying to kill the king. So Mordecai saves the king's life. Then after that, this other guy called Haman, he's an Agagite. Now, some of you might be like, why does that matter? You got to go back. You got to go back to the time of Saul. When Saul was king, God told, I don't know if you remember this story, when God tells Saul to go through and kill all the Amalekites. Mm-hmm. When I say all, he said all. He specifically said, it's in there. Kill everybody. He even killed the cattle. Kill everything. Saul killed most of the people, but he captured King Agagite. Haman is a descendant of that king. So, of course, Haman and Mordecai, because Mordecai's a Jew, you killed all my people. There's some conflict between the two. Haman gets elevated to the second in charge of the entire kingdom. And so when Haman was supposed to walk by, everybody's supposed to bow down to Haman. And Mordecai refused. Mordecai was like, can't do it, won't do it. Right? So because of that, Haman goes to the king and says, hey, king, there's some people in your country, a little small band of people, but they got money. If we took all of them out, we can put some more money in your pocket and we get rid of these troublesome people out of your kingdom. King don't care. He just sounded good. Put some money in my pocket. So he puts out this edict. Remember I told you, once the king puts out an edict, it can't go back on it. Puts out this edict, and in 30 days, all the Jews are going to be annihilated. Mordecai hears this, and so you couldn't be in the king. So one of the rules about ancient kings were you couldn't be in their presence and be sad, right? Because he's the king. Everything should be joyful, right? He's happy, you should be happy, right? You can't have a bad day in front of the king. Those were the rules. So Mordecai was outside of the city, outside of the king's gate, dressed in mourning clothes. Mourning clothes usually was, y'all talk about putting in sackcloth. The reason why he put on sackcloth, he took off his royal clothing, which is probably made of some fine material, and put on the sackcloth. Sackcloth is basically the equivalent of a burlap sack. It's scratchy, it's itchy. That's what he put on. And so Esther hears about this. And I think this is where we're at in our text. So we're in Esther chapter number 4. Yeah, Esther chapter 4. Starting at verse number 1. Somebody read verses 1 through, I told too much, 1 through 5 for us.
When Mordecai learned of all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the city, wailing loudly and bitterly. But he went only as far as the king's gate, because no one clothed in sackcloth was allowed to enter it. In every province to which the edict and order of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's aunts and female attendants came and told her most, she was in great distress. She sent clothes for him to put on instead of his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Then Esther summoned one of the king's eunuchs assigned to attend her and ordered him to find out what was troubling Mordecai and Mordecai.
All right. So Esther was likely in what they call, so when you think of royal marriage, this isn't like what we consider as marriages, right? The king lived in one spot. She likely lived in another spot. And she couldn't come before the king unless he called for her specifically. So it was a little different. It wasn't like she could just barge in there and be like, I'm your wife, like, woman. Usually, because the king usually had his wife, the queen or whatever, then all his concubines, right? And once you were with the king, you couldn't be with nobody else. So the king never called you back by name. You just over there wasted away, right? For lack of better words. But since Esther was the queen, she had attendants, right? She had, and generally, since the king wanted to make sure nobody was playing his pool while he wasn't around, usually all the attendants to the queen or even the concubines were eunuchs. We all know what a eunuch is, right? Okay, so they mutilated these people to ensure they wasn't doing anything they didn't have any business. Okay. So she hears that her cousin is weeping and wailing and running around. Now, let me understand about something about Jewish people. They aren't very stoic, right? When they talk about weeping and wailing, they're making some noise. It's usually loud. It's usually boisterous. It is not a quiet affair. Okay, so it would have been easy to spot Mordecai, falling out. That's basically what he was doing, right? So Mordecai's making a whole bunch of noise, and so when you're putting on sackcloth and you sprinkle your hair with ashes, it's an outward sign of inwardly what's going on, that you're inwardly mourning. And so usually during Easter time, we fast, right? Fast is sometimes an outward sign of I'm trying to get closer to the Lord. So I'm going to let go of some stuff that I think I need and put God first, that he is the number one thing I need. This is why a lot of people during this time do the Daniel fast, which is they give up, like fancy meats and things like that, because they're trying to show God you're more important than whatever this is. That's why generally you don't fast away from like stuff like water, because you kind of need water to live. I remember one time I called it for a fast at the church. There's one lady who was like, I've been blacking out. I'm like, why? I haven't been taking my medicine because we've been fasting. I'm like, find something else to fast about, ma'am. Don't, you know what I'm saying? Like, fast within your, realm, right? And so I try to explain to her. So that's why I've been trying to get away from, after that, I started getting away from doing food fasts a lot of times, because I don't want you to kill yourself. But there's other stuff you can fast from. I don't know, one year we could fast from complaining. Man, how many complaints I got about fasting from complaining? Like, Pastor, every morning something. And I was like, it's supposed to. How else do you learn how to not complain unless you put in a situation where you want to complain? Right? Anyways, So this is what's going on, right? So she's trying to figure out what's going on with Mordecai. Let's keep going. All right. We're at what, verse 6 through 11, looks like. Who has that for us? You read off the screen too. It should be, I thought it was big enough. If you want to.
So Haddish went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him, including the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the text of the edict for their annihilation, which had been published in Susa, to show to Esther and explain it to her. And he told him to urge her to go into the king's presence, to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. Haddish, whatever.
It's all right. Go ahead.
Came up with that and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. Then she instructed him to say to Mordecai, all the king's officials and the people of the royal province know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that he be put to death. The only exception to this is for the king to extend the golden scepter to him and spare his life. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king.
All right. So Haddock explains, like I said, Esther was likely in this complex where the king's women and stuff were, so she might not have known what was going on. Usually I was off to the side. She probably was outside. She probably didn't know what was going on with the edict. So Mordecai not only tells her eunuch what's going on, he gives her the edict to read, right? And so here's what's going on at this bottom. So he's begging her to go into the king's presence. Now, kings of that day were oftentimes worried about being assassinated. How else do you become king unless you kill the current king, right? So they oftentimes would sit. Oftentimes when they're like when they're mulling over things, they're thinking they would be in this inner court, which was surrounded by guards, right? And so you couldn't just walk in on the king, like he had to summon you, right? So if you just walked in on the king, the guards were taught if he doesn't extend the scepter, if he doesn't accept your presence, you're done. So she's basically explaining to Mordecai, and then she's telling Mordecai, maybe the king's cooled off on me because I haven't seen him in 30 days. You know? Because remember what I said, you only saw the king when he calls you. Maybe she's thinking he done forgot about her because he done found him a new little, something new. So he done forgot about her. And so she understands the severity of the situation. You can't just go to the king any kind of way or you're going to die. So what Mordecai is asking her is to do what? Risk her life. This is a big risk. Now, before we get to, should I say it now? Should I wait? I'll wait till we get to it. Okay, let's keep going. This is it. We'll go through Esther 4 and we'll talk through it. All right, let's read the rest of it. All right, I'll read it. When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer. Do not think because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows, but that you may have come to your royal position for such a time as this. Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. Gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days and nights. And I and my attendees will fast as you do. When I'm done, I will go to the king, even though it's against the law. And if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went away and carried off Esther's instructions. Okay. Reason why I love the book of Esther is because nowhere in this book do you hear somebody say, and so says the Lord. There's no spot where there's no prophet who comes and says, the Lord said to do this. God appears to be silent, right? You don't, what Mordecai says is help will come. It's the closest you get to any reference that God is going to do something, right? That's the closest you get to. No direct reference to God anywhere in this text, which I found interesting. There's no spot where you see God sent a prophet or God spoke to somebody in a dream. It doesn't happen in this book. It's all
And why is that?
because I think when they wrote down this particular story, you saw God in it when you look back over it. Most of the time, you don't see God in stuff until you look back over it and see God in it, right? Just like when Moses asked to see God, what does he see? He sees God back. Because oftentimes you don't see God until after he done did what he's going to do. And you look back and go, look at God, right? Usually in the midst of it, you don't see God's providence per se, if that makes any sense, right? But then when you look back over it, you can definitely see. But I think it's purposeful to show God's providence, that God still moves even when we don't see him directly. And also this particular story sets up one of the Jewish holidays. I can't remember which one it is, but it's a Jewish holiday that comes out of this. So this story explains why they celebrate this holiday. Notice, and a lot of Jewish holidays are tied to events that affected the community that they want to keep in remembrance. This is why, even in America, we have our holidays, and the point of our holidays is to remind us of what got us here, right? What's the next one, big one coming up? 4th of July?
Memorial Day.
Memorial Day, sorry. Memorial Day is to remind us of all the American soldiers who laid down their life for the freedoms that we have today, right? That's why we celebrate these things, to remind us of, those people sacrificed in this particular case. 4th of July reminds us of our independence from Great Britain. Still weird, but anyways, this book sets up one of those holidays. But anyways, that's why I like the book of Esther, because there's no direct reference to God in it. And I think a lot of us feel that way. A lot of us would love if we had God himself to speak to us and be like, hey, go do X. Thanks, God, right? Because Esther has not gotten a word from God. She has not gotten some prophet that says, go to the king, you're going to be fine. She says what? I'm going to fast for 3 days. And if I die, I die. There's nothing telling her before she goes that she's going to be okay. Right? And the reason why I bring that up is this is a risk that she's taking. But her risk is birthed out of faith, because she's trusted and believe, like Mordecai said, God's going to bring deliverance, if not through her, then through somebody else. Because remember, at this point, she hadn't told anybody she's a Jew. So she easily could have just sat back and been like, sorry, Mordecai, the rest of you guys, I'm going to survive. But look what Mordecai says to her. He says, if you don't do it, God's going to lift somebody else up. Because Mordecai's a man, he has faith. He's going to lift somebody else up, and you and your family won't survive. And look what he says. Maybe it's for such a time as this, you are elevated. Because for her to go from being just this regular girl to now being the queen, for her to be, a Jewish girl, a girl from of the exiled people, she shouldn't be at the position she's at. And so what Mordecai is saying, maybe it's God's providence that you're at where you're at. So because he already knew that Haman was going to do this, so he was provincial in placing you in that position so you can speak on our behalf. How often do we look at the positions we get to in life and think to ourselves, maybe God put us here, not for us, but to take care of somebody else. Mm-hmm. Right? So notice what she says. She says, we're going to fast for 3 days. And if I die, I die. I should tell you the rest of the story, but I want you to go read it. So anyways. No, I love it. The rest of the book is interesting, and I would advise you to finish it off. But the reason why I bring up this particular account is because this is one of those good accounts that definitely deals with both. It deals with both the faith that comes with walking with God, and the risk sometimes that comes walking to God. We know that I read an article just recently about this Catholic priest. I think he was in Nicaragua, and some civil unrest broke out, and they ended up killing him. And they found one of his letters. I think he wrote home to his family. And one of the things he said in the letter that stuck out to me was, "What kind of shepherd would I be if I run at the first sign of trouble?" And he ended up, he's going through the process of, I forgot what they call it in Catholic Church, but becoming a saint at this point. But I thought that was powerful. Like, he understood that if God placed him there to be the shepherd of these people, how would it look for him to run away at the first sign of trouble? And so I bring this up because oftentimes we get in our comfort zones in church or in life, and I don't want to move. It's safe here. It's cool here. I know how things are going to work out here. Why, God, are you calling me away from this safety to go out here into the wilds of the wilderness and these wolves? I'm fine where I am, right? This is comfortable. This is safe, but we don't grow where we're comfortable. We grow in space. So think about Jehoshaphat's walk with God probably after that account than before that account, right? He's trusting God, I'm sure, a whole lot more after what he experienced than what he experienced. Those lepers, they're trusting God more after that experience than before this experience. When you take risks for God, it helps. God's multifaceted. He grows you. He's helping other people, but he needs you to be a willing vessel. And I'm not saying this is easy. Some of the stuff God calls you to do, you're like, whoo, for real? I got to do that? I'll give a slight example, then we're done. God asked me to forgive somebody. Not gonna lie, I was not feeling it. Because my first comment was, you don't know what they did. I'm talking to God, like, you don't know what they did to me. You saw this, I didn't do anything to them. Why I gotta ask for forgiveness for them? All I kept hearing back was, call and apologize. I wasn't feeling it. Not gonna lie, wasn't feeling it at all. Almost didn't do it. But I did it. I did it, Ruth. You know what I got? You should have apologized sooner. Oh, I was like, see, Lord, what was the point of doing that? They didn't accept it. I could have kept my words to myself, right? Fast forward a couple years. Fast forward a couple years. This person's going off on me about something. And I'm just like, and then when I left, I realized the apology wasn't for them. It was for me. Because once I forgave them, I could move forward and let it go. Now, me and that person have now have a much better relationship. And I look back on it, it probably all stemmed from me being obedient in that moment and apologize. Didn't see it then. Thought God was tripping. Because it was a risk, right? It was risky for me because I'm like, why am I asking this forgiveness from somebody who mistreated me? But God had a greater purpose for it. And so had I stayed in my comfort zone of anger, if I stayed in my comfort zone of frustration, had I stayed in my comfort zone of self-righteousness, I couldn't grow. And what kills a lot of our growth.
I found this on the web.
Okay, thanks, Siri. What kills our growth is we want to remain in our comfort zones, even if they're bad, and it's hindering us from getting where God wants us to go. All right. Any questions, comments, concerns? Did you learn anything?